For over a century, the story of the Titanic has been told and retold so many times that most people can recite it without ever having actually researched a single detail. An unsinkable ship, a reckless captain racing for a speed record, poor passengers locked below decks to die while the wealthy escaped, a single massive gash torn open by the iceberg. It's a clean, simple, morally satisfying story, tragedy caused by arrogance and class cruelty, exactly the kind of narrative that survives for 100 years because it's easy to remember and easy to be angry about. There's just one problem. Once you actually go back to the surviving records, the 1912 inquiries held on both sides of the Atlantic, the recovered wreckage examined by forensic engineers starting in the 1980s and 90s, and the testimony of the roughly 700 people who actually survived that night, a huge portion of what most people believe about the Titanic turns out to be incomplete, exaggerated, or in some cases, flatly untrue. This isn't about diminishing the tragedy. 1,517 people, by the most widely accepted count, still died in the freezing North Atlantic on the night of April 14th and into the morning of April 15th, 1912. It's about understanding what actually happened to them, because the real story, once you strip away a century of myth, is in some ways even more disturbing than the version everyone already thinks they know. Start with the phrase everyone associates with the ship more than any other, unsinkable. It's practically inseparable from the Titanic's name today, repeated in nearly every retelling as the ultimate example of human arrogance being punished by nature. But the actual historical record doesn't support the idea that White Star Line ran a massive publicity campaign built around that word. What actually existed was a single line in a specialized 1910 promotional brochure describing Titanic and her sister ship Olympic, stating that the vessels were designed to be practically unsinkable. A reference to their 16 watertight compartments and electronically operated watertight doors, a genuinely advanced safety feature for the era. That's a meaningfully different claim than an aggressive marketing slogan plastered across posters and newspapers, and there's very little evidence that ordinary passengers booking tickets in 1912 were walking around believing they'd purchased a ticket on a mathematically impossible-to-sink vessel. The unsinkable myth exploded into popular culture largely after the disaster, as newspapers, survivors processing their trauma, and later filmmakers reached for a word that captured the sheer disbelief of what had happened. And it stuck so thoroughly that it eventually became remembered as something the ship's builders had boasted about beforehand, rather than something that was mostly assigned to the story in hindsight. Then there's the myth of the reckless race for a speed record, the idea that Captain Edward Smith pushed the ship to dangerous speeds through a known ice field specifically to win the Blue Riband, the unofficial title awarded to the fastest transatlantic passenger crossing. This one falls apart almost immediately once you look at the ship's actual engineering. Titanic was never designed or built to compete for speed records at all. That crown at the time belonged decisively to a different ship entirely, the Cunard liner Mauritania, which had held the record since 1909 and was significantly faster than Titanic by design. White Star Line's entire strategic approach with Titanic and her sister ships was built around size, luxury, and stability rather than raw speed, deliberately competing in a different category altogether. What is true, and what the official inquiries did establish, is that Titanic was traveling at a fast and, in hindsight, genuinely dangerous speed of roughly 22 knots on the night of the collision, despite having received multiple wireless ice warnings from other ships earlier that day and evening. But maintaining near full speed through reported ice fields wasn't some uniquely reckless decision made by one overconfident captain trying to set a personal record. It was, disturbingly, standard industry practice across essentially the entire transatlantic shipping industry at the time, where captains routinely maintained speed through ice warnings, trusting lookouts to spot danger in time to maneuver around it, a practice the disaster itself would permanently discredit. Captain Smith wasn't uniquely reckless. He was following an industry-wide standard that the entire shipping world would only recognize as catastrophically inadequate after it killed over 1,500 people. The lifeboat shortage is probably the detail people get most confidently and most completely wrong. The popular version of the story usually goes something like this. White Star Line greedily cut corners on lifeboats to save money or preserve deck space for luxury promenades, deliberately leaving passengers without enough capacity to survive. The actual explanation is almost more disturbing precisely because it wasn't a story of one company's greed, but a story of an entire regulatory system that had simply failed to keep pace with how large ships had become. British Board of Trade regulations governing lifeboat requirements dated back to 1894, and those regulations calculated the required number of lifeboats based on a ship's gross tonnage, not the number of passengers or crew actually aboard. Under those outdated rules, any vessel over 10,000 tons was required to carry the same number of lifeboats, regardless of whether it weighed 10,000 tons or, in Titanic's case, over 46,000 tons, and regardless of whether it carried 500 people or over 3,000. Titanic actually carried 20 lifeboats, 4 more than the outdated legal minimum required, with a rated capacity for 178 people. But with roughly 2,284 passengers and crew aboard that night, there simply weren't enough seats for everyone under the actual regulatory framework of the era, a framework that had never been updated to account for ships of Titanic's unprecedented scale, and that failure belonged to an entire industry and its regulators, not to one company deliberately skimping on a specific ship. And what makes the lifeboat story even more painful is what actually happened once the boats were being loaded, because many of them left the ship only partially full. And that detail unravels an entirely different assumption people tend to make. It wasn't a case of desperate overcrowding and chaos preventing full capacity. Several lifeboats launched with dozens of empty seats, including Lifeboat 1, which left with just 12 people aboard, and a boat rated to carry 40. The official inquiries pointed to several overlapping causes. Crew members, following standard maritime protocol at the time, were cautious about overloading boats being lowered nearly 70 feet down the side of the ship, worried the davits and boat structure itself might fail under too much weight during descent, a genuine engineering concern given the technology of the era. There had also been no meaningful lifeboat drill conducted for passengers before the voyage, meaning most people had no assigned boat, no clear instructions, and, in the ship's early evacuation phase, a widespread and understandable disbelief that a ship this massive, this new, and this celebrated could actually be sinking, leading many passengers to initially refuse to board the boats at all, preferring to wait inside the warm, brightly lit ship rather than climb into a small boat suspended over black, freezing water in the middle of the night. Then there's one of the most morally loaded myths in the entire story, the idea that third-class passengers were deliberately locked below decks and left to die while first-class passengers escaped freely. The reality here is genuinely more complicated than either the popular myth or a simple denial of it. There is documented evidence that some gates and barriers separating third-class areas from other parts of the ship were indeed locked or guarded at various points during the evacuation, though the primary original purpose of these barriers wasn't a plot to sacrifice poor passengers, but rather a legal requirement tied to United States immigration law. Since ships arriving in America were required to physically segregate third-class passengers to prevent the spread of disease and streamline processing at facilities like Ellis Island, a requirement that existed on essentially every transatlantic liner of the era, not something invented specifically for Titanic. What the official inquiries did find troubling, and what later scholarship examining survivor testimony has continued to explore, is that in the chaos and disorganization of the sinking itself, several accounts describe crew members being slow, confused, or in some documented instances, actively obstructive in directing third-class passengers up to the boat deck, whether due to unclear evacuation procedures, the physical maze-like layout of the ship's lower decks, language barriers among many third-class immigrant passengers, or a genuine, if unofficial, prioritization of first- and second-class passengers during the confusion. The survival numbers tell their own blunt story regardless of exact intent. Roughly 97% of first-class women survived, compared to just under half of third-class women, and only 16% of third-class men survived, compared to a third of first-class men. Whether that gap is best explained by deliberate cruelty, structural class-based neglect baked into the ship's design and crew culture, simple geography and confusion, or some combination of all three, remains a genuinely debated question among historians, but the sanitized myth of literal locked doors and a deliberate murder plot oversimplifies a more systemic, and in some ways more damning, failure. One of the most persistent character villains in the popular Titanic story is J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of White Star Line, who survived the sinking by boarding a lifeboat, and who was subsequently and viciously vilified in the press, with newspapers coining the nickname J, Brute Ismay, and portraying him as a coward who stole a seat that should have gone to a woman or child. The actual testimony from the official British and American inquiries paints a considerably more complicated picture. Multiple witnesses testified that Ismay spent a significant portion of the evacuation actively helping load women and children into lifeboats, and that he only stepped into collapsible boat C himself, after being told, by crew members present, that there were no other women or children in the immediate vicinity to fill the remaining seats, at a point extremely late in the sinking when the boat was already being lowered. That testimony doesn't erase the discomfort many people feel about a wealthy executive surviving, while so many working-class passengers and crew members died, and it's a completely legitimate thing to sit with morally. But the specific, widely repeated image of Ismay shoving past women and children to save himself isn't well supported by the sworn testimony of the people who were actually there. And it says something notable about how quickly a convenient villain narrative can calcify into accepted fact when it fits the emotional shape people already want the story to have. Now for the mechanical heart of the disaster, the collision itself. Because even this has been substantially revised by modern forensic science in ways that would have been completely impossible for the original 1912 investigators to determine. For For decades, the popular understanding held that the iceberg tore one massive continuous gash along the ship's starboard hull, a wound roughly 300 feet long that doomed the vessel instantly. When the wreck was finally located in 1985 by a team led by oceanographer Robert Ballard and subsequently explored in greater detail through the 1990s using submersibles and sonar mapping technology, the actual damage told a very different story. Rather than one enormous gash, the hull damage consisted of a series of narrow, separated slits and buckled seams spread across roughly 6 of the ship's watertight compartments, some sections barely wider than a few inches, where the iceberg's impact caused steel plates to buckle and rivets to pop rather than tearing open in one continuous wound. It sounds like it should have been less catastrophic than one giant gash, but it was actually worse in a specific engineering sense, because it meant the flooding entered through many separate small breach points across a wider stretch of the hull than a single localized gash would have, overwhelming exactly enough of the ship's 16 watertight compartments, 6 in total, to doom it. The ship had been designed to stay afloat even with up to 4 compartments fully flooded. The iceberg damage compromised 6. Metallurgical analysis of steel and rivet samples recovered directly from the wreckage in subsequent decades added an entirely new layer to the story that nobody investigating in 1912 had the scientific tools to even consider. Researchers studying the recovered hull steel found that it contained a notably higher sulfur content than modern shipbuilding steel, a composition that made it significantly more brittle and prone to fracturing when exposed to extremely cold temperatures. Exactly the conditions of the near-freezing North Atlantic water Titanic was sailing through that night. Separate analysis of recovered wrought iron rivets, particularly those used in certain sections of the ship's bow where the worst damage occurred, found that some contained elevated levels of slag, a manufacturing impurity that similarly weakened their structural integrity, likely due to production shortcuts made under the intense time pressure of completing not just Titanic, but her sister ships as well, within an aggressive construction schedule. None of this means the ship was simply badly built through negligence in any way that would have been obvious to inspectors at the time, since the materials and standards involved were consistent with what was considered acceptable shipbuilding practice in that era. But it does mean the ship's structural failure wasn't purely a story of an unstoppable natural force meeting an otherwise flawless engineering marvel. It was a story of adequate for its time materials, meeting conditions and impact forces that exposed weaknesses nobody had previously had reason to test for. And then there's a more recent, still genuinely debated theory that adds another layer entirely to the collision itself. Journalist and Titanic researcher Sinan Maloney, examining photographs taken of the ship before it departed Southampton, identified what appears to be long, dark streaking on the hull's exterior, in almost exactly the location where the iceberg damage later occurred. Streaking Maloney and several supporting engineers have argued is consistent with a coal bunker fire that is separately documented, through crew testimony given at the original inquiries, to have been smoldering in one of the ship's coal bunkers for days before and during the voyage. The theory, presented most prominently in a 2017 documentary, suggests that sustained heat from this fire may have weakened the steel in that specific section of the hull before the collision ever happened, making it more susceptible to catastrophic failure on impact. It's important to be clear that this remains a contested minority theory rather than settled historical consensus. Many maritime historians and engineers, while acknowledging the coal fire itself is real and well documented, remain skeptical that it meaningfully weakened the hull in the specific way and location the theory proposes, and no definitive metallurgical proof has settled the question either way. But the fact that this debate is still actively happening, over a century after the ship sank, says something important about how much of this story is still genuinely being reconstructed rather than simply repeated from memory. Even the ship's final moments, the images most deeply burned into popular memory through decades of films and paintings, turn out to be more complicated under scrutiny. The dramatic, cinematic image of the ship breaking cleanly in half before sliding intact beneath the waves was actually disputed by White Star Line and several surviving officers for decades after the disaster, who insisted, based on their own observations that night, that the ship sank in one piece. It wasn't until the wreck was actually located on the ocean floor in 1985, split into 2 major sections lying nearly a third of a mile apart, that the breakup theory was definitively confirmed, vindicating the testimony of other survivors who had reported witnessing the ship breaking apart, testimony that had been officially dismissed or downplayed at the time by an official inquiry, apparently uncomfortable with the implications of structural failure on that scale. The famous account of the ship's band continuing to play music as the vessel sank, meanwhile, holds up remarkably well under scrutiny, corroborated by multiple independent survivor accounts describing the 8 musicians playing on deck well into the ship's final chaotic hour, though the specific claim that their very last song was the hymn Nearer, My God, to Thee remains genuinely disputed, with some survivors reporting different final pieces, a small detail that historians still can't fully resolve and probably never will, precisely because none of the 8 musicians survived to confirm it themselves. What emerges, once you actually assemble all of this properly documented, forensically confirmed correction to the popular narrative, isn't a story that makes the Titanic disaster feel smaller or less tragic. If anything, it's more unsettling than the simplified version most people grew up believing. It wasn't one arrogant company boasting about an unsinkable ship, undone by one reckless captain chasing a speed record, deliberately trapping poor passengers to die. It was an entire industry operating under regulations that had catastrophically failed to keep pace with the scale of ships being built, standard practices around ice warnings that every major shipping line followed, and that the entire industry only abandoned after watching this specific disaster prove them fatally inadequate. Materials and manufacturing standards that were considered perfectly acceptable until tested against conditions nobody had planned for, and a chaotic, undrilled, desperately improvised evacuation, shaped as much by human panic, disbelief, and confusion as by any single villain's deliberate cruelty. The real Titanic story isn't a morality tale about one company's greed getting punished by fate. It's a story about how an entire system built from dozens of small, individually reasonable decisions, regulatory assumptions, industry norms, engineering trade-offs, and human psychology under crisis can still add up to catastrophe. And that's a considerably harder and considerably more important story to actually sit with than the simple one most of us grew up believing.